The sinking of the Titanic is often called the worst maritime disaster in American history. It wasn't. A ship called the Sultana holds that record, and almost no one has ever heard of it. On April 27, 1865, the steamboat Sultana exploded on the Mississippi River, just north of Memphis, Tennessee. Of the more than 2,300 people on board, most of them Union soldiers finally heading home after surviving Confederate prison camps. At least 1,168 were confirmed dead. Most historians place the true number between 1,600 and 1,800. That is more than the Titanic, more than the Lusitania, and yet it barely exists in the public memory. The reason is simple. It happened on the worst possible day. As always, viewer discretion is strongly advised. By the spring of 1865, the American Civil War was effectively over. Confederate General Robert E. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox on April 9th. Across the South, Union prison camps were being emptied. Thousands of soldiers, starved, sick, some barely able to stand, were being gathered at a processing camp called Camp Fisk, just outside Vicksburg, Mississippi. These men had survived places like Andersonville and Cahaba, two of the most notorious prison camps in the war. Andersonville alone had a mortality rate of nearly 29%. The men arriving at Camp Fisk were, in many cases, walking skeletons. They had dysentery, chronic diarrhea, scurvy. Some weighed less than 90 pounds. But they were alive, and for the first time in months, sometimes years, they were going home. The problem was transportation. The U.S. Army needed to move thousands of men north up the Mississippi River, and it was doing so by contract, paying steamboat captains $5 per enlisted man and $10 per officer. It was a profitable arrangement, and competition among captains was fierce. Captain James Cass Mason commanded the Sultana, a wooden sidewheel steamboat built in 1863. The vessel was legally permitted to carry 376 passengers and crew. Mason knew the ship well. He also knew something else. One of the Sultana's boilers had developed a leak during the trip south to Vicksburg. A mechanic inspected it and recommended a full plate replacement. Mason refused. He ordered a patch job instead. It would take less time. There were soldiers waiting, and every soldier was worth $5. By the evening of April the 24th, the Sultana began loading troops. It did not stop at 376. It did not stop at 500, or 1,000, or even 1,500. When the boat finally pulled away from the Vicksburg dock, it was carrying an estimated 2,427 people, more than 6 times its legal capacity. No one stopped it. The Sultana moved north against the current of the Mississippi, which was running high from spring flooding. The river had swollen well beyond its normal banks. In some places, stretching 7 miles wide, the added weight of over 2,000 men made the boat sit dangerously low in the water. Every time the vessel rounded a bend, it listed hard to one side, as soldiers shifted to see what was ahead. Crew members had to shout at them to redistribute their weight to keep the ship from capsizing. What no one on board knew was that the patched boiler was under far more strain than it had ever been designed for. The Sultana's engines had to work harder against the flooded current. The extra weight pushed the boilers to generate more steam, and the patch, a thin piece of metal covering a crack that should have been properly repaired, was flexing with every pressure cycle. At around 2 a.m. on April the 27th, 7 miles north of Memphis, 3 of the 4 boilers exploded simultaneously. The blast tore the ship apart from the inside. The smokestack collapsed. The upper decks pancaked downward. Hundreds of men who had been sleeping on the cabin floor were killed instantly, crushed, scalded, or thrown into the river by the force of the explosion. Within minutes, the wreckage caught fire. The Sultana had been carrying over 1,000 bushels of sugar in addition to its passengers, and the sugar ignited. Survivors who had not been thrown into the water now faced a choice: burn or jump into the freezing Mississippi in total darkness. Most of these men could not swim. They had spent months in prison camps. They were malnourished, weak, many suffering from illness. And the river was not a normal river that night. It was a miles-wide, freezing, debris-filled flood, moving at high speed. But that's where the real nightmare began. Men who made it into the water grabbed at anything: broken planks, doors, pieces of railing. But there were over 1,000 men in the river at once, and not enough debris to hold them. Groups of 10 or 15 would cling to the same piece of wood until it sank under the weight. Survivors later described men climbing on top of each other, pushing others underwater to stay afloat. Friendships that had survived years of prison camps ended in the dark water in seconds. Some men who could swim tried to help others. They would grab a drowning soldier and start pulling him toward shore, but the drowning men, in their panic, would lock their arms around their rescuers and drag them both under. Eventually, the stronger swimmers stopped helping. They had to. The river was so wide from flooding that the nearest shore was, in some places, over 3 miles away. In 47-degree water, a healthy person loses motor function within 30 minutes. These were not healthy people. Many simply drifted until they could no longer hold on. What made it worse was the darkness. It was the middle of the night. Men could hear screaming from every direction, but could not see who was alive and who was gone. Some survivors reported floating past groups of men, singing hymns together in the water. Voices that grew quieter and fewer as the hours passed. The first rescue boats did not arrive until nearly dawn, almost 4 hours after the explosion. By then, the river had carried bodies miles downstream. Some were found tangled in treetops where the floodwater had receded. Others were never recovered. In due time, the final count would reveal the full scale of what had happened. But by then, no one was paying attention. Of the more than 2,300 people aboard the Sultana, at least 1,168 were confirmed dead. Most historians believe the true number was between 1,600 and 1,800. Because the Army's passenger manifest was incomplete, men had been loaded in such haste that entire groups were never recorded. Some of the dead were never identified. They were buried in mass graves along the riverbank, marked only as unknown U.S. soldier. These were men who had already survived the war. They had endured Andersonville, 14 by 18 feet of open ground per prisoner, roughly the size of a standard bedroom in a modest home shared with dozens of others. They had survived Cahaba, where the prison flooded so regularly that men slept standing up. They had lived through all of it, and they died on the way home. Captain Mason went down with the ship. He never faced trial, but the investigation that followed revealed something that should have ended careers. Army officers at Vicksburg had been bribed to load soldiers onto specific boats. Captain Reuben Hatch, the chief quartermaster responsible for distributing troops across multiple vessels, had a financial arrangement with Mason. Other boats had left Vicksburg half-empty that same week. The soldiers were not spread across the available fleet. They were concentrated onto one ship, because one captain was paying for the privilege. Hatch was court-martialed. He was acquitted. The reason the Sultana disappeared from history is not complicated. On April 26th, the day before the explosion, John Wilkes Booth was shot and killed in a barn in Virginia. Every newspaper in the country led with that story for weeks. The Sultana received a few paragraphs on inside pages. Within days, it was gone from print entirely. The official account called it a boiler malfunction. But records show that the boiler had been flagged before departure, that a proper repair was refused, and that the ship carried 6 times its legal capacity with the full knowledge of military officials. The story that was forgotten was not an accident. It was a decision made by multiple people for money at the cost of more lives than the Titanic would claim 47 years later. That is not a story about a ship. That is a story about what happens when no one is watching. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to leave it in the comments below. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.